Okay, this is another vlog entry. Again, these vlog entries are when I turn on the camera, I pick a subject, I try and talk about it, and try and make sense and be coherent. Sometimes I'm coherent, sometimes I'm not. Advance warning. But I'm going to try and make this coherent. Today's topic is classic books which are fun and painless to read. Now, just because I hate those YouTube videos which make you kind of wait for like the list, I'm just going to give the list right at the beginning. And then after the list, I'll talk about my criteria. And then after I talk about the criteria, I'll go through and kind of talk about the individual books more in detail. But here's my list. The Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain. Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle. The Lost World, also by Arthur Conan Doyle. The Three Musketeers by Alexander Dumas. Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, also by Robert Louis Stevenson. The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. Arsène Lupin by Maurice Leblanc. And that's it, actually. And then I've got three more on the maybe list. I say maybe because I really like them, but maybe they kind of violate my own criteria about being painless. But let me give them to you and then we'll discuss them later. War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. The Age of Reason by Thomas Paine. And The Iliad by Homer. Okay, so let me get into the criteria first of all. So the idea is to pick classic books which don't read like classic books. Because, you know, like everybody wants to have read the classics, just, you know, so you can be a cultured, intellectual, literary person. But it's often kind of hard going, kind of slogging through them, right? Like I'm reading Don Quixote right now. I really want to have read Don Quixote so that I can talk about how cultured I am and, increase my education. And, I think it's good for me, good for my mental development, intellectual development. But boy, can it be a slog sometime. And a lot of classic books are like this. They're good for you, but I guess they're what they call broccoli reading. They're good for you, but they're not always fun to read. So I want to make a list of classic books which are completely fun to read. Like, it's not even like they're classics. You're like, wow, this is a classic? This is actually fun to read. And I also want to include the idea of being painless to read. Like, the whole thing just kind of flows. You don't have to work for it. So, painless, yeah. I have to exclude a few books that I really like because I'm not sure they're entirely painless. I'll give examples. A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. I really like this book. And there are some really great moments to it, like those courtroom scenes, just of such classic drama. I always am kind of surprised that Charles Dickens was writing before movies were a thing, because he writes these courtroom scenes with kind of a cinematic eye, as if there were kind of a movie camera, and he's directing the camera to focus on different characters and kind of building up the drama of it. I mean, when he's on, he is really, really on. But the book as a whole has a lot of long digressions and descriptions, and you just get bogged down in certain parts of it. And for that reason, even though I love the book, I can't really call it like a painless read. You've got to slog through parts of it. And there are a million books like this, kind of books that I like, but you have to work a little bit at them. One more example. There are many examples, but one example out of many. Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. I really like that book, but like boy, does he go off on some long digressions in there, right? So like you can't really call it painless. You do have to kind of slog through the digressions. So these are books that are just fun, painless. You don't have to work at them. Okay, second term that needs to be defined is, I guess, what is a classic? And boy, could we have a long discussion about that. For the purposes of this list, for this video, I'm just going to say that a classic is before World War I. Why World War I? I think this is kind of something historians commonly do, at least this was common at my university, is to define kind of anything after World War I as a modern era, anything kind of before World War I as kind of like the pre-modern era. Well, pre-modern directly before World War I, and then as you go back, of course, it gets older and older. So yeah, World War I, of course, meaning 1914, so published before 1914. Now, there are, of course, this is an arbitrary cutoff date, because there are all sorts of authors, you know, like Hemingway and Orwell and stuff like that, who are obviously classics in one sense, but who are after my cutoff date. But I think the idea of a classic, I don't know, we can argue about the definition, but to me, part of the idea of a classic includes surviving the test of time. So like, I know there are a lot of really great books around nowadays that someday will be classics. We can argue about what those books will be, but I don't think you can call them classics yet really until they've survived the test of time. That's just part of my own kind of personal definition of classics. It includes in it passing the test of time. The other thing is, like, if you get into modern classics, the definition really gets murky. Like Hemingway is obviously classic, but what about, you know, like Isaac Asimov or Ray Bradbury? Are they, you know, kind of cult classic science fiction authors? Are they classics? Yeah, I don't know, they might be. Yeah, it gets really murky. The other thing is there's just too many modern classics that are fun to read. I mean, we'd be here all day. The other thing is this kind of list would be underwhelming. I mean, what's the use of me saying, like, To Kill a Mockingbird or Catch-22 is a classic that's fun to read? Because, of course it is. Like, everybody knows To Kill a Mockingbird is really fun to read. And, you know, it's a modern book. So, of course, modern books are fun to read for modern audiences. So I think in order for, like, the list to kind of mean anything, you kind of have to, I mean, there's no use taking books from the 50s and 60s and saying, yeah, they're still fun to read now. Because the 50s and 60s weren't that long ago. They were still writing for modern sensibilities. I think where you get a book from the 19th century and you say, oh, this book was from the 19th century, but it's still fun to read, I think that's where kind of the more novelty of the list comes in, the more surprising parts of it. The other part of that cutoff, though, is there were some pulp books, pulp fictions written before World War II. So what about a book like Tarzan or The Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs? I mean, these are obviously just pulpy books. Are they classics? Yeah, maybe they are. I'm going to kind of fall back on this defense by W.H. Auden. He said, some books are undeservedly forgotten, none are undeservedly remembered. So I guess if that's your dictum, then even these pulp fiction books, if they've survived over 100 years, yeah, maybe there's something to them. So I think like a book like The Princess of Mars could theoretically make this list. As it happens, it doesn't. And the reason is The Princess of Mars, I didn't hate it, but I thought it was a little bit exhausting, just kind of one action sequence after another with no room in between to breathe. And I don't think it doesn't make my list of personal favorite books. But The point being, like, it totally could by this criteria. I don't know. You can debate me on that. Okay, a few more disclaimers on this. So the cutoff date is 1914. Now, when I was making this list, I didn't intend to do this. I just picked out all the books, the books before 1914 that I thought were fun and painless to read. And it turns out that of all kind of, 3,000 years of human literary history, almost all of these books are right near the cutoff date. Like the good number of these books are kind of after 1900, so in the years between 1900 and 1914. I think all of these books were like written after like 1850. So like they're all kind of in the last kind of 75 years leading up to that cutoff date, which is, in a way, it's kind of too bad. I wish my list kind of went back and included more books from like older ancient history. But, maybe it's not surprising. Modern people prefer modern books. So even with the cutoff date at 1914, most of these books are kind of in the last few years leading up to 1914. I am trying to sneak in the Iliad. That's partly kind of affirmative action in the literary sphere. I want kind of one book before the pre-modern period. But I'll talk about that later, how that's kind of arguably breaking my own rules on this. Okay, one more disclaimer and then I'll try and get into this. I'm going off of memory. I've not reread these books in preparation for the video. Some of these books I'm going way back in my memory to like my memory of childhood, and childhood including adolescence and middle school here. Some of these books are much fresher in my memory because I've read them this past year. And those are the books where I kind of actually still have my copies lying around the apartment with me. So just take my opinion with a grain of salt if my memory gets a little bit foggy here. Okay, all those disclaimers being said, let me jump into it and kind of talk about the books I think, yes, they're classics, but they're also fun and painless to read. Okay, The Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling. Okay, remember how I just said the memory was a bit foggy on these? This is one of them where the memory is a bit foggy. I read this all the way back in 7th grade. I'm 40 years old now, so this is not quite 30 years in the past, but pretty close to it. I don't remember it in detail, but I remember kind of picking up the book and being like, every time you pick up a classic book, you've got a little bit of, what's the word? You're a little bit anxious. You're like, oh, this is probably going to be really old and boring because it's from the 19th century. And I remember just getting really hooked on it right from the first page, loving the whole thing, just kind of reading it very smoothly, and completely enjoying it. So for whatever those memories are worth. Other books by Rudyard Kipling. I actually remember as a kid enjoying the Just So stories. I haven't reread them recently, but I remember liking them as a kid. I think they're a little bit politically incorrect nowadays, or at least some of them are, but I like them. Another book by Rudyard Kipling that doesn't quite make this list is Kim by Rudyard Kipling, which I read about 5 years ago. I like Kim. I like Kim a lot. It's an interesting story, and it's got a lot of interesting stuff in it. It's like a spy story from the 19th century, so it's got all these cool spy elements. It's kind of like James Bond, if James Bond had taken place 100 years before in the 1880s. But it wasn't quite painless. There were some confusing parts and some kind of long descriptions. So Kim doesn't quite make this list, but it's an interesting book nonetheless. Okay, next, Mark Twain. To the best of my memory, I have never read anything by Mark Twain that I didn't like. But I am told by people who have read a lot more Mark Twain than I did that if you kind of get into his archive, like his less famous books, some of them can be a bit of a slog. I don't know. I've only read his more famous ones. So, Tom Sawyer, can't talk. Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. Now this is one volume, but this is actually two different books. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Of these two, I think the one that best fits my criteria of just being fun and painless to read is Tom Sawyer. I mean, this is just so modern. You know, it's all about a kid kind of getting into mischief and his misantics and misadventures. And it just reads like something that could have been written today. I mean, it takes place during the 1840s, but it reads... the sense of humor and kind of the beats of the story are just so modern. It's just such a funny and fun to read and painless book. Huckleberry Finn is where we're getting into, in terms of painless, I'm bending my criteria a little bit. Because Huckleberry Finn requires a little bit more engagement. There are sections of Huckleberry Finn where we go on these digressions and where it gets a little bit of a slog, maybe just a little bit. Now, every literary critic in the world ever agrees that Huckleberry Finn is, in terms of literary quality, the much more superior book. In fact, they call it like the greatest American novel ever written. Not me, all the famous critics call it that. Although who am I to disagree with them? But in terms of like this particular list, where we're judging things by being fun and painless, parts of it are a little bit of a slog. You're like, oh, where is this going? The plot kind of meanders a bit, but then it comes back at the end and it's really fun and kind of humorous at the end. There are a lot of fun and really fun and humorous sections of it that more than make up for it. So it makes the cut. There are two other lesser-known sequels, Tom Sawyer Abroad and Tom Sawyer Detective, which aren't great books, but they're painless enough to read. So yeah, maybe it makes the list as well. Kind of a minor entry, Tom Sawyer Abroad and Tom Sawyer Detective. And then, yeah, the other book is Connecticut, Yankee, and King Arthur's Court, which I read about 15 years ago. So I don't have a copy with me now. But, yeah, I remember that as just being a really funny book. I mean, it's just it's just Mark Twain writing a satire on these old medieval legends. And it was just really funny. Mark Twain can be really funny. I mean, you don't expect somebody that old to be that funny, right? Because he's writing all the way back in the 19th century. So you're like, this is old, it's not going to be funny. But that book really made me chuckle. I mean, Mark Twain is just a really clever satirist. Yeah. Okay. Next, moving along. Jules Verne, Around the World in 80 Days. Now, let me preface this actually by talking about a couple of Jules Verne books which didn't quite make this list. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which I found boring, to be honest. Although I read it all the way back in 7th grade, so I'm probably due for a reread on it. But I know people who have read it recently, and they've told me, yeah, it's pretty boring. Journey to the Center of the Earth is a book I like. I think it's got really imaginative ideas in it. Like, there's some really fascinating parts of it. And I like it in the abstract, kind of talking about all these weird and wonderful things they encountered under the earth. But when you're actually reading the book, parts of it are a bit of a slog. You know, kind of all this kind of wandering around in the tunnels. It gets a little bit boring at parts. So Journey to the Center of the Earth doesn't quite make this list, although I've got great fondness for it. But Around the World in 80 Days, this book is just a lot of fun to read. It's a funny book. The plot moves at a fast pace. It just starts out really funny, and it kind of keeps going, and it doesn't slow down. Sorry, I'm repeating myself, aren't I? It's just really funny, and the plot moves at a fast pace. I recommend it. Oh, sorry, a disclaimer. I should have made this at the top of the list. With any French or Russian or kind of any translated book, the caveat always goes depending on the translation, assuming you get a good translation. Because, I can't vouch for the original language, but the translations I read, I really liked. Okay. Next one. Sherlock Holmes. Now, I'm cheating a little bit on this because I said 1914 was my cutoff date. Arthur Conan Doyle actually wrote these stories over like a 40-year period, like just kept going and kept going and kept going. This is volume 2. There's a volume 1, which I've gotten in a different place back at my parents' house. Yeah, at least the stories started back in 1807, so they at least start before my cutoff date, even if I think the last collection of stories is after World War I. I'm still counting the whole thing. Yeah, these are just really fun to read. They're not great literature, although it's clever. It's clever, kind of the plot twists and kind of all the things like Sherlock Holmes notices, but they're not like philosophical, like in that sense of a classic. But yeah, they're just really fun to read. I think I first tried to read these in 5th grade, and I found it a little bit of a hard slog. I think I just wasn't ready for reading adult books. But then I picked these up once I was in my 20s, and I just thought, oh, these are great. I think once you're kind of in your 20s, these just kind of read like a modern detective story. And they're nice and short. I mean, there are 4 novels in the Sherlock Holmes canon, but the majority of the canon is just kind of short stories, about 10 to maybe 20 pages. So you can finish them in an afternoon. They're just kind of really fun and interesting. Yeah. By the same author, The Lost World, singular, which is a dinosaur story. Really fun story. Found it really kind of quick and easy to read. Okay, next, by Robert Louis Stevenson, I've got a couple books on the list, Treasure Island and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Now, Treasure Island, I always loved this story as a kid, but I never actually read the real book. I read like abridged versions of it or, comic book version of it. And I tried to read the real thing when I was in 2nd grade and just found it too hard going. I think it was originally published as a children's book, but I think as time moves on, the classifications change. The prose is Victorian. It's not really a children's book anymore, but for an adult, it's perfectly readable. And oh wow, what a great story Treasure Island is. I don't want to say like it doesn't get its due, because it's a book everybody knows even today, like 150 years after it was published. But it doesn't get its due enough. People don't talk about it enough. I mean, what a great story. Kind of basically everything we think of when we think of the pirate story genre was just created out of this story. And it's the Captain Flint is just such a great character. Long John Silver is such a great character. The adventures on the island and the twists and turns and the buried treasure and kind of finding out what happened when Captain Flint died and all this kind of mystery around it. This book does not get enough credit. Like, this is a great adventure book. And again, it's another book where you feel like you're cheating. I mean, I know a lot of these books, they're classics kind of primarily in the sense that they pass the test of time, not in the sense of like Dostoevsky, where they're a great philosophical work. I mean, this is just essentially a boy's adventure story that has passed the test of time, but I'm counting it as a classic, and boy, what a great read that is. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, again by the same author. I really enjoyed that book. It suffers a little bit in the fact that the modern reader knows exactly what's going to happen as soon as you open the book. I mean, like, you know, right? Everybody knows the surprise twist at the end, that it turns out, I don't want to spoil it just in case you don't know, but yeah, you know, right? Everybody knows what the twist of this book is. So there's a lot of build up towards a twist that the modern reader already knows because it's so into pop culture, but it's readable enough. And I don't know if you've seen this thing recently. It was a lot shorter and smaller than I thought it would be. In my edition, it was only like 88 pages. So like it's not even 100 pages. It's like a novella rather than a book. I read the whole thing in an afternoon. So, you know, if you want to like knock a classic off your list just in an afternoon, something that's short and readable enough, even though you already know what the twist is, yeah, I'd go for this one. Okay, well, I'm on the subject of Robert Louis Stevenson. A couple of his books, I'm just going to talk briefly, that did not make the list. Kidnapped. Kidnapped, I like it, but it's not entirely fun and painless. It starts off great. It starts off with a bang. You know, it's exciting at the beginning. There's a kidnapping, not to give anything away. There's this great big fight at the beginning of the book. It takes place in a ship, kind of. It's like Treasure Island because I think they're fighting. Who are they fighting again? I forget. They're fighting pirates or mutineers or something. There's this, yeah, really awesome fight scene at the beginning, which is, in terms of like a blow-by-blow account of the fight scene, this is actually better than anything that's in Treasure Island. But then they get off the ship and they're in Scotland, and then there's just this long trek across Scotland where it really slows down and it becomes a lot less exciting. So Kidnapped doesn't quite make this list. There's a sequel to Kidnapped. Did you know there was a sequel to Kidnapped? You can track it down somewhere. It's called, what's it called? Catriona or something like that, which I really didn't like Catriona. It was just really boring, and it was a romance story that just wasn't going anywhere. So I really didn't like the sequel. Then the other book by Robert Louis Stevenson, The Black Arrow, I liked it, but it had kind of a confusing plot and it was a bit difficult. The momentum of the plot had a hard time kind of building up because the plot kept changing directions as to kind of which story it was going to be. It's worth reading, The Black Arrow, but it doesn't quite make this list of entirely fun and painless. Okay, moving on. Peter Pan. Now, Peter Pan, I guess, I think the stage play actually came first. The stage play, I think, is called Peter and Mary. Or no, maybe the stage play is called Peter Pan and the book is called Peter and Mary. I don't remember. I'm just going to call them both Peter Pan. First one was a stage play, which I think was published in 1904. And then Peter Pan, the book, I think was published around 1914, kind of just before my cutoff date. I've not actually read the stage play, but I did read the book. I actually read it twice. I read it once kind of as a kid in 6th grade. And I don't remember the reading experience entirely, except that I remember just really loving it. And I remember loving it so much that I was afraid to finish it, which is, very rarely do I get this do I get this feeling. Because even with books I really like, I usually just want to finish them just for the feeling of accomplishment of finishing a book. This book I was actually afraid to finish, so I was actually kind of limiting myself to 1 chapter a day, just so I didn't kind of lose the pleasure of finishing it too soon. I'm out of time on this video. We're going to have to make this a 2-parter. So I'm going to pause it now, and then I'm going to come back in part 2 and continue talking about Peter Pan, and then get through the rest of the books on this list.